Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Fabric Tech Talk Fridays. I'm your host, Swetha Mannepalli, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Microsoft. Today, this is one of my favorite topics where if folks are planning to move from traditional SQL Server data warehousing to Fabric Spark, how does that transition kind of looks like? And to talk about this very important topic, we have Ásgeir Gunnarsson. He's one of our MVPs. Ásgeir, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so as said, my name is Ásgeir Gunnarsson. I come originally from Iceland. I've been working with data for many years, close to 20 years now. Data warehousing, very traditional data warehousing on SQL Server for a long time, and then some Power BI, and then some Fabric, and then I've been transitioning in the a few years ago. I started thinking about Spark and what to do that, and I will come back to that later on. And yeah, I've been MVP for 9 years now in the data platform category, where I've been like focused on modern data warehousing and lake housing and Power BI for a while. And
Wonderful.
I live in Denmark, and I actually run some conferences and do a lot of community work there as well.
That's great. So my journey started as an ETL developer. So this topic, whenever people talk about data warehousing, it hits home for me personally. So looking forward to our conversation today, Asgar. So let's start with what are the key business and technical drivers for someone to transition from SQL Server data warehousing to the Fabric Spark world.
Yeah, there are a few things that are. So if we look at the some of the technical reasons first, some of the technical reasons might be that when you have a SQL server, you have a tightly coupled compute and storage, and that might be okay. But it means that every time you want to access a storage, you need to have a compute on, and so you typically will need to have a pretty fixed size compute and a fixed size storage, and they need to be very tightly coupled to each other. By decoupling those, which typically what which Spark does, there are some other cloud technologies that do it as well, but Spark does that really well. That means that you can use the compute when you need it, and then you can just throw it away or discard it. And but the
Mhm.
storage is still there, the data is still there, it's still accessible. If you have any kind of other compute, or if you want to spin up a new compute to access that. And so that's one thing. Another thing is that Spark is a parallel processing technology that can give you a lot of performance if you have the data for it, and if you have the know-how to use it correctly. Then it can give you a lot of performance in a way that it's in a typically in a cheaper way. So that's one of the business reasons. Now, there's no there's no guarantee that cloud is cheaper than on-premise, or the Spark is cheaper than SQL Server, but it can be because you have that. If you want to do SQL Server data warehouse that can perform really well, you typically have to have a really big hardware underneath it, and then you typically have to have that hardware on all the time, or have to have it. You have provision it, and then you need to keep it for all the time. Well, as I said before with Spark, you are, spin up compute, and then you discard it again when you're done with it. Um, and then you also get some other things with Spark that can be very interesting. You have multiple languages that might be interesting if you want to do something more than just data engineering. Maybe you want to do some AI, or maybe you want to do some things that are difficult to do with SQL, the language, and that you could do with Python or R or Scala or something else. So though there are loads of different reasons why you want to move. I wouldn't say that everyone needs to do it, but it's
Mhm.
something that I think most people should at least look at to see if there's a benefit for them there.
No, that's a great explanation. And some of the things that really make sense is from a cost performance perspective, as well as innovation. If you want to unlock a lot of opportunities from the AI perspective, definitely Fabric Spark is the place to be. Thank you for all the laying out all the differences and the reasons for someone to start thinking about their transition from typical regular SQL Server data warehousing techniques. Now, how do you decide? How one can decide what are the workloads that I would like to migrate first to Fabric Spark? Are there any best practices on start here first and then see how you can progressively move from a phased approach? How was your transition, Asgar?
So my transition was pretty Typically I work as a consultant, so I go from project to project. So mine, I have done few migrations, and when you are looking at a migration, then you typically want to look at where is my benefits here? If you're not going to do like a one big migration and say, I need to take everything before I start anything, you don't have to do that. You can could run parallel for a while. And then you would look at where is my biggest benefit. And that typically is going to be with this really heavy, transformation, project or transformation, things that you're doing. So if you have a store procedure that is running for 3 hours every night because it needs to crunch to a lot of its different data, or really big merge that is merging 500 million rows or something like that. These kind of things, if you have these kind of things, Spark is typically much faster with those because it's really good at parallelizing, and you can scale really, really easily. So those kind of things, moving them first, and then it will also help you get the cost benefit really fast, and it will make it easier to transition the rest because then you have already shown value before you take the rest of it. But I think you know most workloads will actually benefit from it, and not only because of cost or performance, but it is also development advantages with Spark that I really like. Which I think a lot of SQL developers would really love when they get used to it.
Oh, I have a few questions on that. We'll get to it. But before we go there, what does the architecture kind of looks like before versus after you move to Fabric Spark? Can you show us a reference architecture diagram or such, Asger, to bring it to life?
So yeah. So if we can share my screen, I'm just going to show you. It's not a reference architecture. It's just a very very simple couple of slides that I would want to show you. And I think my main motivation with these two slides here is to actually show people that work with SQL that the world is not very different. There's not a lot of things. When you look at the architecture itself. So if you look away from the actual hardware architecture and the way that the computer and the engine works underneath. If you just look at the more logical way that we do. So if I look at the way I did it for 15 years, the way I did data warehousing, I did typically some kind of extraction from load, or ELT, ETL, or whatever you call it. You took the data from the source system, you landed it in a database, and typically as is. You just took it from there and you landed it as is. Then you would do some transformations either through views, store procedures, or even moving it with integration services from one database to another, doing the transformation on the fly there. You landed it, and then you landed it again when you needed to do the actual data marts, or you want to do the presentation layer. And then you typically put Power BI on top of it. So this is way we've done it for a long, long time. Before Power BI, of course, it was reporting services or something else, but this is the way we've always done it. And this is the Kimball architecture. It's very, very well thoroughly tested, and it has always worked. And then if you look at what we do in Spark, and if you look at some of the Spark godfathers and people that have always worked with Spark, and they have typically said, okay, we want to do a medallion architecture. So if you think about Spark and Lakehouses in Spark, that is where they talk about medallion architecture. And if you think about medallion architecture, it's typically bronze, silver, gold, or raw, clean, whatever you call the layers. It's basically a layered architecture. And if you think it back to what I just said before, ETL, ELT, that's a layered architecture. We are actually doing pretty much the same thing. We are taking the data unchanged, we're landing it in something, we are transforming it, and then we are putting it into a presentation layer. It's exactly the same process. And that exactly makes it so much easier if you're coming from a SQL Server world. You don't have to think about your Kimball architecture, the things that you've done all the time. You can keep on doing them. You're just going to call it something different, or not. You can call it DTL because it's just names. So having that way to get in with the same architecture, I think is a great benefit. And there's something that when I started, working with Spark, I was so surprised that this is how it works, and I was so I was so glad that I didn't need to change that. I could just concentrate on actually the development work and the benefits and using the compute correctly instead of thinking I need to redo all my architecture. You can simply plug and play your old architecture into Spark, and if you feel like calling it something different, just call it something different.
This is amazing. So if I kind of reiterate what we just talked about, Asgar, rather than keeping it in a very waterfall model, it's super agile when you move to Fabric Spark. You have this bronze, silver, gold, like you mentioned. You can do a lot of these manipulations. You can adopt to your ETL or ELT, however you choose. But it's all in that same architecture, and you're not reinventing a whole lot, but taking advantage of the cost per performance, doing things at scale in a really quicker time, with less cost associated with it, as well as a lot of these AI capabilities that opens a lot of doors for your own business. So very, very well put. Now, I know coming from a data warehousing background, typically all our business logic is logged into this T-SQL, SQL Server stored procedures, functions, user defined functions, what have you. Now, to move from that data warehousing to a Fabric Spark or Lakehouse model, what are the migration challenges that you have observed, and how to mitigate those?
Yeah. So again, this is where I think it's really nice. If you're a SQL Server developer, that when you go to Spark, and if you can, if you're okay with things being called something different, then they might look a little bit different, but you can actually keep pretty much the same way. So if you are used to doing store procedures, if you're used to doing your transformation via store procedures, you can think of when you come to Spark, you will typically do them in notebooks, and notebooks is basically a code container. You put some code in it, it's going to run in the compute. And what is a store procedure? That is exactly that. That is basically just a code container. Now, so you can think that you can keep the way you're doing things by moving your store procedures to a notebook instead. Now, you would typically not move one to one. You might be able to, but you typically not do that. So you might need to refactor them a little bit. And of course, you need to understand that not all T-SQL can run in Spark SQL. So there might be some things that you have done. You might have some cursors, or you might have things in T-SQL that you're doing that simply won't work in Spark SQL. And so there's typically some refactoring, being done. But my experience is that 90% of the code will actually run on Spark, but you probably want to split it up a little bit, because then you can take advantage of what a notebook gives you
Mhm.
over a store procedure, for example. So
Got
so yeah, so you will actually don't have to change a lot, but you can benefit if you do that.
Okay, you took me way back to when I started with curses, the dreadful cursors. Oh my god. Oh, row by row, and yeah, it's a lot of tedious, time consuming. Oh, yes, definitely Fabric Spark is the way to go for such really labor intense ETL logic that you have embedded in these store procedures. If you can take advantage of the MPP architecture on Fabric Spark, definitely the way to go. That is really well explained. Thank you, Asgar. And at Fabric Tech Talk Fridays, we typically want a demo wherein we don't talk the talk, we want to walk the talk. Let's take us to your computer and show us what you got, Asgar.
Yeah, so I have just to keep things a little bit simple. I have a Fabric workspace here, where I have some code in here, just to show you a little bit how it could be. And that doesn't have to be like this, but this is just a small one system, which is a tiny little one, where I have some a Lakos items. And if you are wondering, what a Lakos Spark Lakos item is in Fabric, you can think about it as a container in a Azure Data Lake. Is the Data Lake Gen 2, for example? It's basically just where you put your things in, your data into. You can think of it as a database as well, if coming from a SQL Server background. And then I have a bunch of notebooks, and I have some pipelines. You might not have it all in one workspace. This is just for simplicity. I'm just putting it here in for simplicity. And so in this case, I have some pipelines that are doing some of my orchestration, and then I have some notebooks that are doing my code. So you might have a notebook, something like this here, and it's just a simple one, just to show you something what we've done, where we have some parameters on the top. In this case, and then I have some code that I run on across all my all of my tables. So that's stored in another notebook, and then I have just my query in this case. And then you can write all these things that I'm doing here. You can write them in SQL, you can write them in Python, or write them in Scala. You can write it in a mix. In this case, for example, I have Python and I have some SQL, and I have lots of different things in here that can just run all together. And this is something that I heard is really, really good. And what I said before about the store procedure, typically when we do complex things in SQL Server, we have a store procedure that might be 5 pages long. It might have dynamic SQL in it, which is doing all kinds of things. You typically have a dynamic SQL if you want to metadata drive your workloads. And so what is great about working with notebooks is that you can split your code into different cells, and you can run them in parallel, sorry, in sequence, or you can run them independently. You can step into your code and debug it while it's running, so you don't have to worry about is if you split it up that you have to run it as a whole as you do in SQL. You can run this part, and then you can run the next cell, and it will remember what the other cell did because it's all in memory. And this is something that made me fall in love with Spark. That I used to debug those horrible store procedures if something went wrong, and to having been able to split them up into many different cells, and then just simply go and walk through them without having really to change a lot of the code. And this is something that I really, really, really love. So
I want to also call out two other things that you just mentioned, Asgar. You have the flexibility within the notebook. You have the flexibility to start changing your language. If you feel like SQL is the right way to just group these items in the product table, I would go say start using SQL, and then I can switch back to using Spark, using Python code. So that level of flexibility is amazing, and notebook is one of those that can provide that kind of flexibility. So
yeah,
amazing
so
from a developer perspective.
totally agree. And what I really very typically do, so like this is just a small demo, is that I will have my notebook as a Python notebook. I have all the uh, framework thing in Python. So getting the it's typical. So the some of the metadata and things like that is going to be in Python, and then now it's just Spark SQL here, but I might have a SQL cell here that will run simple proper SQL that it does my business logic. That is how I typically will work with it. And then I will end everything with Python again because I'm closing off the framework again. So this is something that is great flexibility and gives you, and also like if you're coming from a SQL Server background, you can write probably 90% of whatever you want to do in SQL if that's what you want to do. And I think that's
Mhm.
something that's very feasible to do. And if you just create things around it in Python, and then you need to learn a little bit of Python, but otherwise you can get out, away with the working with a lot of the SQL work. And I think that's something also that helps us all dogs that have been working with SQL a lot for a long time to actually, transition. It will make it much, much easier.
That is amazing. Before we close out, we would be amiss if we don't touch on governance and security aspects when moving from the traditional data warehousing to Fabric Spark. Would you want to touch on that? And then this is amazing to see how easy it is to do lift and shift, like you said, plug and play your existing data warehousing from SQL Server to Fabric Spark. But yeah, talk to us about how do you think about the governance and security aspects once you move to Fabric Spark?
Yeah, so I think it's a twofold thing, so it's when you if you think about the data warehouse on a SQL server, you will typically have like someone has access to the server, someone has access to the database, and someone has access to the data itself. So you might be able to create data, but you don't have access to the actual database or the actual server. And it's very similar in Fabric. You have these layers of security as well. You have access to Fabric or not. You have access to a workspace or not. You have access to the actual item, so the Lakehouse item. You have access to that, or you don't have
Mm.
access to that. And then you can actually do data security as well, where you can go down to very granular level. And it's actually a little bit more simple in Fabric to do a granular security because it's GUI based. If you're up
Yeah.
to that, if you rather want to script it, you can do that as well, which is probably at the moment slightly easier to do in the SQL Server, but you can still do it, in a very flexible way. You go, object level security, column level security, row level security. And because you have for every lakehouse, you have a SQL endpoint, you can actually do things in very similar way as you're used to do them in SQL Server. And then, of course, around it, there's a lot of monitoring. There's a lot of built-in monitoring. There's loads of APIs that you can use to see, when things have been running, if they failed or not. And you can go in and monitor your resources and how everything is doing. Think if you're coming from a SQL Server background where you have, typically a piece of hardware that you have your SQL Server on, that's pretty easy to understand. So
Mhm.
probably one of the most trickiest things to understand when you move to Fabric is that capacity and how it works with the bursting and smoothing. But as soon as when you get the grasp of those kind of things, you can also start reaping the benefits of those. Running things really fast, using very minimal resources, by borrowing a little bit from the future, which is something that it is impossible to do with a SQL Server.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today, Asger. If you haven't already started your transition to Fabric Spark, after talking to Asger, it's amazing to see how easy it is to do the lift and shift. Hope you all took advantage of all the greatness that Asger shared today with us today. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you everyone for watching. If you found this video valuable, don't forget, hit that like button.
If this is your first time visiting the Microsoft Fabric YouTube channel, be sure to smash that subscribe button.
Drop a comment below on what you'd like to see on future episodes of Fabric Tech Talk Fridays.
That's it for today. See you all next Friday for another deep dive into Microsoft Fabric.